Have you ever thrown yourself at a complex problem? Maybe it's, I don't know, a sprawling software architecture or a tangled deployment pipeline, or even just the messy organizational structure of your team, only to find that your honest efforts just don't really move the needle.
No.
Or, even more frustrating, sometimes they seem to subtly, almost inexplicably, worsen the very problems you're trying to solve. It's that kind of pervasive feeling of hitting an invisible wall, like you're just tweaking things at the surface and the real levers are hidden somewhere. What is actually going on there?
Yeah, it's a classic frustration, isn't it? And it brings us directly to this fundamental concept in systems thinking.
Yeah.
Leverage points. These aren't just, random fixes you might try.
Right.
They are those specific and often deeply counterintuitive places within a system where a relatively small, really well-placed intervention can trigger a disproportionately large and hopefully lasting shift in the system's overall behavior. And our entire deep dive today is rooted in the foundational work of Donella H. Meadows, specifically chapter 6 of her seminal book, Thinking in Systems. It's aptly titled, Leverage Points Places to Intervene in a System.
So this is like the search for the elusive silver bullet, right? The miracle cure, that magic password we all kind of intuitively yearn for when we're faced with these really daunting challenges. We just want that one simple fix, don't we?
We absolutely do, yeah. And that intuitive desire, it's powerful.
Yeah.
But as the pioneering systems theorist Jay Forrester noted, these high leverage points, they're frequently counterintuitive.
Huh.
Forrester's early work, for instance, famously showed that economic growth, which, many leaders often champion as the ultimate solution, can actually be a source of problems like poverty and hunger when you look at it through a systemic lens.
Wow, okay, that's
Yeah.
unexpected.
Right. Or, in his urban dynamics study, he made the really surprising finding that less subsidized low-income housing could paradoxically lead to better overall urban well-being for a city, even for its low-income residents. It was all about altering the underlying feedback loops. These findings really challenge our typical linear sort of cause and effect way of thinking.
And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. Our mission, really, is to unpack Donella Meadows' authoritative and, frankly, deeply insightful list of 12 leverage points. Think of it like we're ascending a ladder of influence. We're moving from the least impactful interventions all the way up to the most profound ones, the ones that actually reshape the very nature and purpose of a system.
Yeah, the really deep stuff.
Exactly. Our goal is to equip you, our listener, especially if you're, say, a senior software engineer grappling with complex tech landscapes, with a powerful framework. This framework should help you identify precisely where to truly intervene for lasting, positive change, whether you're looking at your code, your deployment pipelines, team dynamics, or even the broader organizational culture.
And just to be clear, this won't be a superficial overview. We're really going to try and delve into every detail, every underlying mechanism, and every implication. We want to provide you with what we kind of call a board exam caliber understanding of each point.
Board exam caliber, I like that.
Yeah, allowing you to truly grasp the depth and the practical applicability of Meadows' profound insights. Because they really are quite profound.
Okay, so we'll start with those seemingly simple surface-level tweaks that, let's be honest, often absorb so much of our energy, and then we'll ascend step by step, taking you on a journey to the most fundamental shifts in mindset and purpose. It's like moving from just adjusting a single knob on a machine to maybe redesigning its entire operating system.
That's a great analogy. Let's dive in.
All right, so we're starting at the very bottom of Donella Meadows' hierarchy of leverage points, what she considers the least impactful. Numbers, constants, and parameters. What are we actually talking about here?
Right, so parameters. They're essentially the numerical values, the ones that set specific rates or levels inside a system.
Okay.
You can kind of picture them as the finely tuned knobs or dials on some complex machine where you can adjust specific quantities like maybe speed or temperature or volume. They're the most visible things, often the easiest things to manipulate, which frankly makes them very tempting targets for intervention.
So in a system diagram, these are literally the faucets you can open or close, increasing or decreasing some kind of flow. For you, the senior software engineer listening, think about your daily work. I mean, how often do you find yourself tweaking a configuration file, adjusting a timeout value, maybe changing a cache size?
Precisely, yeah. In the software world, parameters absolutely manifest as values in, say, a config.ini file or environment variables that dictate system behavior, or even sometimes hard-coded constants right there in your code base.
Oh yeah, the hard-coded ones.
Don't get me started. But things like setting a maximum number of retries for an external API call, defining a specific thread pool size for a service, or allocating a memory limit for a microservice instance, these are all parameter adjustments.
Makes sense.
Now, while they are absolutely necessary for, fine-tuning performance, optimizing resource use, scaling your applications, the core insight here from Meadows is that they fundamentally don't address the deeper architectural flaws or systemic issues.
Right.
So, if your system is inherently prone to a deadlock situation because of some complex race condition, simply increasing the timeout parameter for a resource lock,
Yeah.
that won't fix the underlying race condition itself.
No, it just delays the inevitable, maybe.
Exactly. It'll merely delay, or sometimes even worse, it'll mask the symptom until it just reappears under different load conditions, maybe when you least expect it. It's a Band-Aid, really, not a cure.
Meadows gives some really insightful examples to kind of drive this home, doesn't she? Like, take the national debt or the annual budget of a country.
Mm.
Congress, presidents, regardless of their political affiliation, they spend immense energy arguing about parameters like tax rates and spending allocations.
Yeah,
These debates are super politically charged, of course, because they connect directly to voters.
sure.
But despite all the fireworks and the heated debates, the national debt, what Meadows vividly calls a money hole, it just keeps deepening. The only real difference is the rate at which it deepens.
Yeah, the slope changes, but the direction is the same.
Exactly. The underlying system's behavior, its fundamental tendency to accrue debt, doesn't really change because the faucets and the plumbing, the core structure, the goals, the feedback loops of the whole political and economic system, they stay the same.
Another clear example is environmental standards. Governments set things like ambient air quality standards or maybe establish allowed annual cuts for forests. These are explicit numerical limits or targets parameters designed to control environmental flows.
And corporations do this all the time too, right?
Constantly. In the corporate world, common parameters include things like wage rates, product prices, profit targets. Corporations are always adjusting these numerical values to manage what Meadows metaphorically calls their profit bathtub. They're just trying to optimize the flow in and out of that bathtub by tweaking these numbers.
And it's not just big economic or environmental systems. I mean, it extends to social policies too, right? Like the minimum wage or the amount of conservation land set aside or how much is spent on AIDS research versus military hardware. All numerical values, all parameters.
And Meadows even provocatively suggests that personnel changes, firing people and getting new ones, including politicians, can often be seen as just another form of parameter adjustment.
Huh. Okay, that's interesting.
Well, think about it. While different individuals might come in and turn the faucets differently, if the design of the faucets and the underlying plumbing of the system are unchanged, the system's core behavior is pretty unlikely to fundamentally alter. She specifically highlights how, in her view, electing Bill Clinton versus George Bush Sr. didn't fundamentally alter the U.S. political system because any president gets plugged into the same underlying structure, the same flows of information, the same foundational rules.
So the message is pretty clear then.
Yeah. The key takeaway here, the core insight Meadows wants us to really grasp, is that parameters are dead last on her list for powerful interventions. They represent, as she puts it, diddling with the details, or maybe like arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Yeah. These adjustments rarely stabilize systems in the long run, or effectively slow down out-of-control growth. I mean, think about it. Campaign contribution caps don't truly clean up politics, do they? Because the underlying desire for influence, that remains. The Federal Reserve's constant fiddling with interest rates hasn't eliminated business cycles. We're perpetually shocked by downturns because we're just adjusting a number within a much larger, more complex system.
Right.
Decades of strict air pollution standards in Los Angeles, yeah, they improve the air, but as Meadows says, it's not clean because the fundamental drivers of pollution, like car dependence, they remain. Similarly, just increasing police spending doesn't make crime disappear. It addresses a symptom, maybe, not the root causes. These are all examples where parameter adjustments, while seeming direct, just don't tackle the core systemic issues.
So if you're a senior software engineer listening, you might be picturing this giant, complex machine, your entire system, maybe where you can only turn these small labeled knobs. You're definitely doing something when you tweak those values, right? You feel busy, you're making changes. But are you truly reshaping its core function or just kind of nudging its current state within these predefined boundaries?
Yeah, exactly. And to put it in a scenario you might face, your microservice experiences high latency. So you decide to increase the database connection pool size. Is this a high leverage intervention according to Meadows' framework?
Based on this, I'm going to say no.
It's a clear no, right? It's a parameter adjustment way down low on the leverage scale. It might provide temporary relief or optimize a specific bottleneck, sure, but it doesn't address potential fundamental architectural flaws or deeper systemic issues that might be causing the latency in the first place.
Like a bad query or something.
Could be a poorly optimized database query, yeah, or an inefficient inter-service communication pattern, or maybe an inherent scaling limit in the service itself that you're just pushing against. At the end of the day, it's symptom management, not root cause resolution.
Okay. Let's move up just one notch on Meadows' ladder of leverage. We find the size of buffers and other stabilizing stocks. What exactly are we talking about here when we say buffers?
Buffers, yeah. In a system, they're essentially reservoirs of capacity or resources. These can be physical entities like water in a dam, or they can be conceptual equivalents in data or information, like items in an inventory.
All right.
Their core purpose is really to absorb shocks and stabilize the system by dampening fluctuations between inflows and outflows. They create a sense of steadiness, of resilience.
Meadows uses a really intuitive analogy here, contrasting a large lake with slow inflows and outflows, which is incredibly stable against a small river with fast flows, which is highly prone to catastrophic floods. That vividly illustrates that a large stock-to-flow ratio inherently creates more stability within a system. The sheer volume of the lake just acts as a massive buffer against rapid changes in water levels.
And we see this principle absolutely everywhere. In your personal finances, for example, keeping a substantial amount of money in a bank account. That acts as a financial buffer. It provides far more stability and, frankly, peace of mind than relying solely on your daily income and expenditure.
Sure does.
Businesses, they hold inventory in stores or warehouses. This inventory acts as a buffer, allowing for smooth operations and customer fulfillment, even when there are sudden fluctuations in customer demand or unexpected supply chain delays.
Right, they don't have to order exactly when I buy something.
Exactly. The buffer absorbs that variability. In ecology, maintaining a minimum breeding population for an endangered species provides a critical buffer against extinction. Meadows also mentions geology, noting that soils in the eastern U.S. are more sensitive to acid rain than western soils because they naturally lack large calcium buffers that could neutralize the incoming acid.
So it seems clear. Increasing buffer capacity can stabilize a system. But there's always a trade-off, isn't there? You don't just infinitely increase buffers. What's the downside?
You absolutely hit on the core dilemma there. While buffers are powerful stabilizers, they can also lead to inflexibility. An overly large buffer can make the system react too slowly, become sluggish, unresponsive.
Ah, okay.
And of course, building and maintaining large buffers like massive water reservoirs or vast physical inventories or even very large data caches in software can be incredibly expensive and resource intensive.
Right. Cost is a big one.
Huge. And this is precisely why concepts like just-in-time inventory strategies gained so much traction in business. Companies deliberately made a trade-off. They chose to reduce the costs associated with holding large inventories and increase their operational flexibility, even if it introduced occasional vulnerability to supply chain fluctuations.
So they consciously reduced the buffer.
They did. This choice highlights that sometimes the cost or the inflexibility of buffers can outweigh the cost of occasional disruption, leading to a deliberate reduction in this leverage point.
And in terms of leverage itself, how does Meadows position buffers compared to parameters? Still pretty low.
While certainly more impactful than simply adjusting parameters, yeah, Meadows observes that buffers are often quite physical and concrete entities. A dam's capacity, for instance, is, as she puts it, literally cast in concrete.
Right, hard to change quickly.
Exactly. This makes them not easily changed in the short term, which places them lower on the leverage scale, despite their undeniable stabilizing power. Building new infrastructure or acquiring vast new resources is a significant long-term undertaking.
Okay, so for you, the senior software engineer listening, where do you see buffers in your software systems? Think about things like queues, caches, maybe replicated data stores.
Oh yeah, these concepts are directly applicable. Database connection pools are a prime example, right? They act as buffers, managing the flow of requests to the database, making sure you don't overwhelm the database with too many simultaneous connections and cause it to fall over.
Definitely use those.
Message queues like Kafka or RabbitMQ, they're classic buffers. They queue incoming requests between microservices, allowing for asynchronous processing and, crucially, absorbing sudden spikes in traffic, preventing those dreaded cascading failures across your distributed system.
Yeah, queues save us a lot.
And caching mechanisms, like Redis or memcached. They store frequently accessed data, maybe in memory or on disk, to absorb repeated read requests. This significantly reduces the load on back-end databases and improves response times. All buffers.
It's quite vivid to picture a buffer overflow error, isn't it? That's
hmm
precisely when your system's buffer isn't large enough or isn't properly managed for the incoming flow, leading to a crash or performance degradation, or sometimes even a security vulnerability.
Absolutely. Conversely, an excessively large cache, while it might seem beneficial at first glance, could end up consuming way too much memory, leading to its own set of performance problems, driving up infrastructure costs, or even causing subtle stale data issues if it's not properly invalidated. It's all about finding that optimal size, that balance.
Right.
So here's a kind of board-style question for you. Your system uses a message queue for inter-service communication. Is making the queue much, much larger always beneficial? What are the trade-offs you need to consider in terms of cost, latency, and resilience?
Okay, yeah, that makes you think.
The core insight here is that while a larger queue might absorb more spikes and provide greater fault tolerance, sure, it could also increase end-to-end latency for individual messages. They just sit there longer.
Right, waiting in line.
Exactly. It consumes more resources, driving up costs, and it could potentially hide upstream issues if messages just sit unprocessed for too long, masking a problem that needs fixing. It's definitely a nuanced balance, not a simple, bigger is always better solution.
Okay, moving further up the ladder now to the next level of influence. We have stock and flow structures, what Meadows refers to as the very plumbing of the system. This feels like a significant jump up from buffers.
It absolutely is. This point refers to the physical arrangement and the connectivity of stocks and flows within a system. It's the literal blueprint, the underlying architecture, that dictates how different elements are physically connected and how they interact with one another.
Okay.
It's not just about the size of a single buffer anymore, but how that buffer is situated within the overall network of pipes and reservoirs, how information flows, how resources get distributed. It's the map of the system.
So we're talking about the fundamental blueprint, the kind of fixed pathways that govern movement and interaction within the system.
Meadows offers a very powerful historical example here, the Hungarian road system. Its historical design fundamentally funneled all traffic through the capital, Budapest.
Oh, I can imagine the traffic jams.
Exactly. This was a deep, inherent structural flaw that basically guaranteed massive and persistent congestion. Changing this structural arrangement would require a colossal infrastructure rework, building new highways, bypasses, you name it.
Yeah.
It's far beyond just adjusting traffic light timings, which is a parameter,
Right.
or adding more lanes on existing roads, which is like increasing a buffer.
Yeah.
Similarly, Meadows notes that a massive central planning systems, such as the Soviet Union or General Motors, necessarily functions poorly, partly due to its rigid hierarchical stock and flow structure.
Why is that?
Because such structures inherently struggle with information delays and adapting to localized changes. Their rigid design makes flexible information flow and localized decision-making incredibly difficult, creating bottlenecks and inefficiencies everywhere.
So this physical arrangement, the plumbing, it has an enormous effect on how a system operates, but it's incredibly difficult to change. Is that the gist?
Precisely. These structures are often, as we said with buffers, literally cast in concrete. Think of a physical dam or a city's road network, or, in organizational terms, they involve deeply entrenched patterns, hierarchies, reporting structures that are very difficult and costly to reconfigure.
High impact, but hard to move.
Exactly. It's a high leverage point because of its profound long-term impact on behavior. But it's usually intractable in the short term due to the sheer effort, the capital required, and the organizational inertia involved in making that kind of alteration.
Okay.
And a critical related point here is that the stock and flow structure also often dictates the inherent delays in a system designed with long-term sequential delays embedded in its very plumbing. Think of a traditional batch processing ETL pipeline, for example. It cannot magically adapt to short-term real-time changes without a fundamental re-architecture of its entire flow. The structure dictates the timing.
Okay, this is deeply relevant for you, the senior software engineer.
Mm-hmm.
What is the fundamental architecture of your main software product? I mean, is it a monolith? Is it microservices? Is it some kind of distributed event-driven thing? How does that core design, that plumbing, affect its behavior, its scalability, its limitations?
This is exactly where we talk about those big architectural choices that define your software. Consider the fundamental difference between building a monolithic application versus moving to a microservices architecture.
Huge difference.
Huge. Or migrating from centralized databases to distributed ones. Changing from a monolith to microservices is a prime example of a fundamental change to the stock and flow structure of your software system. Similarly, re-architecting a data warehouse from a, say, nightly batch ETL pipeline, which has those inherent delays we mentioned,
Right.
to a real-time streaming solution using something like Kafka and Flink.
Okay.
That fundamentally changes the core plumbing of your data flows. It enables entirely new patterns of data consumption and analysis that were simply impossible before.
It's like that city water pipe analogy again. Rerouting the main water supply to a new district is a massive undertaking, right? Huge investment, years of planning, significant disruption. But it fundamentally changes how water flows in the city, maybe enabling new residential or industrial development.
That's a perfect analogy. And similarly, migrating a monolithic application to a microservices architecture, it's a huge, challenging project, often called a digital transformation for a reason.
Yeah.
But it fundamentally redefines how data and logic flow, enabling new behaviors, new scaling patterns, new kinds of resilience characteristics that were simply not possible within the old structure.
Okay, so here's a board-style question for you. Your organization is debating a major re-architecture. Let's say moving from a tightly coupled monolithic system to a more loosely coupled event-driven microservices architecture. How would Meadows' concept of stock and flow structures inform this discussion? And what are the inherent difficulties you would anticipate, looking beyond just the technical challenges?
That's a great question, because Meadows pushes you to think beyond code. You need to consider not just the technical debt of the existing system, but also the organizational inertia, right? The "we've always done it this way" problem.
Exactly. The potential skills gap within your teams, the entrenched communication patterns that are part of the current plumbing of your organization. All of these non-technical factors deeply resist such a profound structural change. It's not just about rewriting code, it's about rewiring the organization.
Continuing our ascent, we now consider the length of delays relative to the rate of change of the stocks being controlled. Okay, this sounds incredibly important, especially after linking structure to delays.
It is. Delays, as Meadows defines them, refer to the time it takes for information to travel through a system, for decisions to be made based on that information, or even for physical processes to unfold within any given feedback loop. They are incredibly powerful, yet often overlooked, determinants of how a system behaves. Honestly, they can make or break a system's stability. And we see these everywhere in the natural world, right? You mentioned pollution earlier. Think about the decades or even centuries it takes for pollutants dumped on land to trickle down through the soil and contaminate groundwater. That's a massive delay.
Huge delay.
Yeah.
Or the generational delay inherent in demographics, the time between a child's birth and their readiness to have a child themselves. That's a fundamental delay in population dynamics.
Okay.
In human-made systems, consider the time lag from a new technology's successful test phase to its widespread installation and adoption across the economy, or the period it takes for a price to adjust to a supply-demand imbalance in a market. Markets aren't instantaneous.
Right.
Meadows' famous car dealership model vividly illustrates the critical role of delays. It's a classic. Despite the dealer's entirely rational actions trying to keep inventory steady, several inherent delays mess things up. There's a perception delay. Maybe they average sales over 5 days to discern real trends rather than reacting frantically to daily fluctuations.
Makes sense.
Then there's a response delay. They adjust their orders partially over, say, 3 days, not instantly placing a huge order. And finally, a delivery delay. Maybe it takes 5 days for new cars to arrive from the factory.
Okay, multiple delays interacting.
Exactly. And these delays, acting together, lead to significant oscillations in inventory, wild swings from having way too many cars to having way too few.
So what was the surprising part?
The fascinating and deeply counterintuitive finding from her model was this. Trying to shorten the perception or reaction delays in the model, trying to react faster, actually worsened these oscillations.
Really? Faster was worse.
Yeah. The system became more unstable, swinging more wildly between excess and shortage. The actual solution, the one that dramatically damped oscillations and led to much smoother inventory levels, was counterintuitive. It was to lengthen the reaction time, give the system more time to calmly assess the real trends before reacting.
Wow. Okay, so these delays are critical to system behavior. What are the core implications for intervention then, if faster isn't always better?
The implications are profound. Delays dictate how fast systems can react, how accurately they hit their targets, and the timeliness of information flow. Now, if delays are too short, paradoxically, they can cause overreaction, leading to a system chasing its tail and amplifying oscillations, making it incredibly unstable.
Like the dealer reacting too quickly?
Exactly. Meadows specifically points to the great push to reduce information and money transfer delays in financial markets. Well, it sounds efficient, right? Faster trades. In her view, it's just asking for wild gyrations and increased instability because the speed of reaction outstrips the inherent delays in the real economy that those financial markets are supposed to reflect.
Okay. And what about delays that are too long?
Conversely, if delays are too long, they can lead to damped, sustained, or even exploding oscillations. But critically, overlong delays, especially in systems that have some kind of threshold or danger point, can cause overshoot and collapse.
Overshoot and collapse. That sounds bad.
It is. It's where the system crosses a point of irreversible damage before it can even register and respond to the warning signs because the feedback is too slow. Think of a population growing way beyond its environment's carrying capacity due to a delay in recognizing resource depletion or accumulating pollution. By the time the signal arrives, it's too late.
Meadows highlights, though, that while delays are high leverage if you can change them, often things take as long as they take. You can't just magically shorten the construction time of a major capital asset or the maturation time of a child. Those are kind of fixed, inherent delays.
Exactly right. Therefore, a crucial practical intervention, especially when the delays themselves cannot be easily altered, is often to slow down the rate of change in the system itself.
Ah, okay, change the system's speed, not the delay.
Precisely. This allows those inherent feedback delays, which often can't be changed, to not cause as much trouble. It gives the feedback loops time to catch up. Jay Forrester's pioneering world model, for instance, indicated that slowing economic growth was actually a greater leverage point for managing global problems like resource depletion and pollution than trying to speed up technological development or market adjustments.
Slow down the car instead of just demanding better brakes.
That's exactly the analogy Meadows uses. It's about adjusting the system's speed to match its inherent response time, allowing its natural feedback loops to function properly.
Okay, for you, the senior software engineer, picture a developer frantically trying to fix a production bug without fully understanding the system's inherent delays, maybe network latency, database commit times, cache invalidation delays. Their rapid, uncoordinated actions might just make things worse, right? Like Meadows' car dealer shortening reaction time and increasing oscillations.
Absolutely. These kinds of delays are rampant in software systems. Network latency between microservices, the processing time for a complex database query, or a heavy machine learning model. The time it takes to deploy a new feature through a complex CI/CD pipeline, or even the human feedback loop in monitoring an incident response.
The human delay.
If your monitoring system has, say, a 5-minute delay in reporting critical metrics, reacting instantly to a perceived problem might be a huge overcorrection based on stale data, leading to unnecessary interventions and potentially further instability. You're reacting to the past.
So practical scenario. Consider your CI/CD pipeline. Are there delays in your testing or deployment stages that might cause overshoot in resource allocation? Like you spin up way too many servers for a transient spike because the scale down signal is delayed? Or does it lead to an unstable deployment frequency? How might you slow down the change rate for stability rather than trying to eliminate delays you maybe can't control?
That's a great way to frame it. You might implement strategies like gradual rollouts, canary deployments, or A/B testing. What do these do? They essentially slow down the rate of change being introduced into the live system, giving you more time to observe the impact and react before the full change hits, respecting the inherent delays in monitoring and response.
Okay. And a deeper question. Your distributed system relies on eventual consistency for its data, which inherently introduces significant delays in data propagation across nodes. How might these delays lead to that overshoot and collapse scenario if not properly managed? And what strategies could you employ based on Meadows' insights beyond just, say, trying to optimize network speed?
That's a tough one. You might need to consider implementing stricter validation at the edges of the system, trying to prevent bad or inconsistent data from even entering in the first place. You could design for idempotent operations, so that processing the same message multiple times due to delays doesn't cause harm. Or even, as Meadows suggests might be necessary, you might need to deliberately slow down the rate of updates or transactions in some parts of the system to allow consistency to catch up before new conflicts or inconsistencies can arise. Sometimes slower is safer.
Okay, let's take a quick breath and reflect. We've covered quite a bit. So far, we've gone from the least influential, those surface-level tweaks of parameters,
Right, the knobs.
to the stabilizing but often rigid buffers,
The reservoirs.
then to the fundamental stock and flow structures, the actual plumbing of the system.
The architecture.
And finally, we just discussed the crucial but often fixed delays, where adjusting the system's speed, not the delay itself, is often the key intervention.
That's right. And remember, we are systematically working our way up this ladder of impact. We're moving from interventions that are primarily physical or numerical towards those that involve information, dynamics, and ultimately the deeper cognitive and cultural aspects of systems.
Right. Things are getting more abstract now.
They are. And this is where the truly powerful, albeit maybe more abstract intervention points really begin to emerge.
All right, stepping up the ladder again, we now reach the strength of the negative balancing feedback loops.
Okay.
This sounds like the system's natural self-correction mechanism we hear about.
Exactly. Balancing feedback loops, often called negative feedback loops, are absolutely ubiquitous in all systems, both natural and human-made. They are the essential self-correcting mechanisms designed to keep important stocks like temperature, inventory, blood sugar within desired bounds. They're constantly seeking stability or a specific goal.
Right.
Think of them as the system's natural tendency to oppose any direction of change that pushes it away from equilibrium. They're always trying to bring it back into balance.
It's the classic governor on an engine or the thermostat analogy, isn't it? That perfectly captures their goal-seeking nature. If it gets too hot and the thermostat kicks in to cool it down, too cold, it heats it up.
Perfect analogy. And for balancing loop to actually function, it requires several key components. First, you need a goal, like a desired room temperature for that thermostat. Second, you need a monitor of the actual state, the thermometer detecting the current room temperature.
Okay.
Third, you need a comparison mechanism to detect any discrepancy between the actual state and the desired state. And finally, you need an action that can be taken to close that gap, turning the furnace or the air conditioning on or off.
And Meadows says they need to be strong enough.
Yeah, she emphasizes that these loops must be strong enough and swift enough to deal with the impacts they are meant to correct. And crucially, the information feeding into these loops from the monitor must be clear, unambiguous, timely, and truthful for them to operate effectively. If your thermometer is broken or inaccurate or gives delayed readings, your thermostat just won't work properly right.
Right, garbage in, garbage out. Now, Meadows points out one of the big mistakes we often make is actually stripping away these emergency response mechanisms. Why on earth would we do that?
It seems counterintuitive, but we often do this because these mechanisms aren't used frequently, or they appear costly in the short term. Think about maintaining natural wetlands that absorb floodwaters that land might seem wasted or unproductive until a major flood hits, and then its value becomes obvious.
Okay. Short-term thinking.
Exactly. The dire consequence of weakening or removing these balancing loops is that it drastically narrows the system's range of survival and resilience. Think about human encroachment on endangered species habitats.
Yeah.
We're essentially removing the natural balancing loop that ensures biodiversity and ecosystem stability.
Yeah.
Or for us as individuals, think about encroaching on our own time for personal rest, recreation, socialization.
Guilty as charged sometimes.
We all are. But these are vital balancing loops that maintain our mental and physical well-being, our flexibility. Remove them, and you seriously risk burnout or breakdown. Meadows also points out that companies and governments are often fatally attracted to distorting price signals with things like subsidies, taxes, or other forms of confusion that effectively weaken the market's natural balancing feedback power.
How so?
Well, if a price doesn't reflect the true cost of something, maybe because of the subsidy, the feedback loop telling consumers or producers about its scarcity or environmental impact gets muffled. Similarly, she argues the brainwashing power of centralized mass communications and the influence of lobbyists in a democracy can limit and bias the flow of information, severely eroding the self-correcting feedback mechanism of democratic governance by obscuring the truth.
And the problem of scale is critical here too, isn't it? A balancing loop might work fine at a small scale, but what happens when the system grows or the disturbances get bigger?
Absolutely critical point. A thermostat might work fine on a mildly cold day in a well-insulated room, right? But not if you throw open all the windows during a blizzard. The external disturbance becomes way too large for the loop's design strength.
Right, it gets overwhelmed.
Exactly. The strength of the balancing loop must be relative to the impact it's trying to correct. Traditional fishing controls, for instance, were probably sufficient for centuries. But then new technologies like sonar and massive drift nets came along, drastically amplifying the impact of just a few actors. Suddenly, it became possible to overfish entire populations, completely overwhelming the existing regulatory balancing loops.
Oh, okay.
This illustrates a broader point. Big industry often requires equally robust or big government or regulatory frameworks to hold it in check. And a global economy ultimately probably demands global regulations to maintain balance across nations. The loops have to match the scale of the potential imbalance.
So strengthening these balancing loops is a higher leverage point than the things we've discussed so far because it deals with the information control parts of the system, not just the physical quantities or structures.
Exactly. It's about improving the system's ability to sense and respond appropriately. Meadows provides several examples of how to strengthen these loops. In health, she talks about preventive medicine, exercise, nutrition, things that bolster the body's intrinsic disease-fighting ability, its natural balancing loops, rather than just treating symptoms after they appear.
Makes sense.
In agriculture, she points to integrated pest management, which encourages natural predators of pests, strengthening a natural balancing loop instead of relying solely on external chemical interventions that can create new imbalances down the line.
Okay.
In governance, it's initiatives like the Freedom of Information Act, which reduces secrecy, or whistleblower protection laws, which ensure critical, truthful information can flow to the right places, allowing public oversight to act as a stronger balancing force.
Right, letting the system correct itself.
And in economics, she talks about things like impact fees, pollution taxes, or performance bonds. These aim to internalize external costs, ensuring that those who benefit from an activity also bear its true environmental or social cost. This creates a more accurate feedback loop for economic decision-making.
Okay, so for you, the senior software engineer, think of a well-architected system. You've got robust error handling, maybe circuit breakers, rate limiters in place. These are essentially your software's balancing feedback loops designed to prevent cascading failures and maintain stability under stress.
That's an excellent parallel. Auto-scaling groups and cloud infrastructure are a direct, almost textbook example of a balancing loop. They monitor the load on your applications, that's the actual state. They compare it to desired thresholds, that's the goal. And then they automatically add or remove instances, that's the action, to maintain optimal performance and cost efficiency.
Classic feedback loop.
Absolutely. Robust monitoring and alerting systems that trigger automated responses or prompt human intervention when system health deviates from the norm. That's another balancing loop. Implementing security controls to counter threats is yet another. The desired state is a secure system, the actual state might be a vulnerable system, and the action is to patch or harden defenses. It's all about bringing the system back to a desired, stable state.
So let's take a scenario. Your e-commerce site experiences a sudden, massive surge in traffic, maybe a flash sale. How do multiple balancing feedback loops like load balancers distributing traffic, caching mechanisms serving static content, database connection limits preventing overload, how do they interact to keep the system stable? And crucially, what happens if one of them is too weak or simply breaks under the strain?
Right. The key here is understanding that these often work in layers. If any one of these layers of defense, the load balancer, the cache, the connection pool is insufficient or fails, the surge could bypass it and overwhelm the next layer down the line.
Right.
This can lead to a cascading failure where one weak loop causes the whole system to crash. The strength and coordination of all these balancing loops contribute to the overall resilience. You need defense in depth.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's explore the flip side. The strength of the positive reinforcing feedback loops. These sound like the exact opposite of what we just discussed. Vicious circles, maybe?
They absolutely are the opposite. Reinforcing feedback loops, also known as positive feedback loops, are self-enhancing mechanisms. Unlike balancing loops, which seek stability and equilibrium, these loops lead to exponential growth, or, in a destructive context, runaway collapse. They're essentially vicious or virtuous circles where an action produces a result that then amplifies the original action, causing a kind of snowball effect.
Snowball effect, right. So what's the leverage point here? Strengthening them sounds dangerous.
Exactly. Meadows emphasizes that reducing the gain around a reinforcing loop, meaning slowing down its rate of amplification or growth, is usually a much more powerful leverage point than merely strengthening the balancing loops that might be trying to contain it.
Okay, slow down the runaway train.
Precisely. And it's certainly far more preferable to letting a reinforcing loop run uninhibited, which, as you said, can lead to uncontrolled growth that overwhelms the system or catastrophic decline.
This is a critical distinction. Meadows uses that powerful example again from the world model population and economic growth rates.
Right.
Slowing these down, reducing their gain, their exponential nature, provides crucial time for various balancing loops through technology, market, social adaptation to actually function effectively.
It's exactly like her analogy, slowing the car when you're driving too fast. Rather than just demanding more responsive brakes or technical advances in steering, you're tackling the speed of the runaway process itself, which gives all the other corrective systems a chance to react and rebalance before you crash.
Okay. Another pervasive example she uses is what she calls the success to the successful trap. This sounds familiar.
Oh, it's everywhere. This archetype is driven by powerful reinforcing loops, where the winners of a competition could be individuals, companies, even ideas, receive resources or advantages that then enable them to win even bigger next time, further amplifying their lead.
Like the rich getting richer.
That's a classic example.
Mhm.
Consider wealth inequality. Rich people accrue interest on their capital. Maybe they pay proportionally less tax due to sophisticated accounting or lobbying power, and then they can provide better education and inheritance to their children, perpetuating their advantage cycle after cycle.
And the flip side.
Meanwhile, poor people often pay high interest rates on debt. They might face higher prices for buying small quantities of goods. They often receive worse education or have fewer opportunities. This perpetuates their poverty. It's a self-reinforcing cycle, a vicious circle of disadvantage locking people in.
And this isn't just about individuals, it happens in markets too.
Absolutely. It's deeply observed in market concentration. Karl Marx's critique of capitalism touched on this very idea. The competitive exclusion principle in ecology describes the same dynamic. If two firms or species are competing for the exact same limited niche, one will inevitably gain a slight advantage, allowing it to reproduce or grow faster, and eventually it will drive the other to extinction. Not necessarily through direct confrontation, but simply by outcompeting them for all the available resources.
So that explains monopolies or oligopolies.
It's a major driver. It helps explain why the many automobile companies in the U.S. historically reduced down to just the big three, or why most cities now often have only one dominant newspaper, or the relentless trend of increasing farm sizes as smaller farms get bought out. It's a natural consequence of reinforcing loops playing out in competitive environments.
So if this is so powerful and pervasive, how do you intervene in the success to the successful trap? How do you break that cycle?
Meadows suggests several strategies, targeting different parts of the loop. Diversification is one. Encouraging losing competitors to maybe exit the current game where they can't win and start a new one perhaps by creating a fundamentally new product or entering a completely new market rather than just trying to beat an established winner at their own game.
Oh, a different niche.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Another approach is limitation on winners. Think of antitrust laws. At least in theory, they exist to limit market dominance and break up monopolies, although, as Meadows notes, large companies often lobby intensely for the weakening of these very laws.
Right.
A third strategy is actively leveling the playing field. This involves policies that deliberately remove advantages from the strongest players or increase advantages for the weakest. Examples include things like progressive income tax, inheritance taxes, or ensuring universal access to high-quality public education.
Trying to give everyone a fair shot.
That's the idea. And lastly, Meadows mentions redistribution, citing traditional potlatch cultures that periodically held ceremonies to redistribute accumulated wealth. This kept everyone in the game, preventing extreme concentrations of power or resources that could destabilize the community.
Okay, let's bring this back to software. For you, the senior software engineer, you see these constantly. Think of viral loops in marketing. The more users a platform gains, the more they spread the word, which attracts even more users. That's a powerful, often desirable, virtuous reinforcing loop.
Absolutely.
But what about the darker side? A technical debt spiral. The more you rush a feature to market, the more technical debt you accrue. This debt then makes it harder and slower to add the next feature, which leads to more pressure, more rushing to meet deadlines, creating a vicious cycle that can absolutely cripple a team or a product over time.
That's a perfect example of a reinforcing loop working destructively. In software, a virtuous reinforcing loop might be a successful product gains more users, which in turn generates more valuable user data, leading to better machine learning models and more personalized experiences, which then makes the product even more successful and attracts even more users. It feeds itself.
The network effect.
Exactly. Conversely, that destructive vicious cycle could be constant quick fixes to meet unrealistic deadlines, lead to more bugs and a less stable, harder to understand code base feed, which means more development time gets spent on fixing issues rather than building new value, leading to customer dissatisfaction, maybe lower revenue, which then creates more pressure from management for even more quick fixes. It's a downward spiral that accelerates over time if you don't break it.
So here's a challenge for you listening. Identify a reinforcing feedback loop in your software development process, or maybe in your product itself. How could you reduce its gain? How could you slow it down to prevent runaway positive effects, like uncontrolled user growth leading to unmanageable scaling issues? Or conversely, how could you halt a destructive, vicious cycle like that technical debt spiral you might be caught in?
It really involves looking for those exponential accelerators, the things that feed back on themselves, and finding ways to moderate them, maybe introduce balancing loops, or fundamentally change the incentives driving them.
Right, let's quickly recap again. We've explored balancing feedback loops, which are stabilizing and can be strengthened for better system resilience,
The thermostats.
and then reinforcing feedback loops, which amplify growth or decline, where the key intervention is often to control their gain, their rate of amplification.
The snowballs.
This recap really highlights our shift, doesn't it? From purely physical interventions like structures and buffers to those involving the dynamic flow and control of information and these feedback mechanisms within systems.
Absolutely. We're definitely moving deeper into the system's control panel, you could say. The levers have become more abstract, maybe harder to grasp initially, but their potential impact is far, far greater.
Building right on that idea of information, we now come to the structure of information flows. This focuses specifically on who does and does not have access to information within a system. This sounds like a really common problem in almost any organization, right? Missing information.
It absolutely is. And Meadows argues it's incredibly critical. This point refers to the pathways, the accessibility, and the transparency of information within any system, precisely who gets what information, when they get it, and in what form. She states quite directly, quite forcefully actually, that missing information flows is one of the most common causes of system malfunction.
Wow, one of the most common.
Yeah. If critical information is distorted or delayed or outright withheld, the system's feedback loops, both balancing and reinforcing, which are vital for self-correction and adaptation, simply cannot function properly. Decision makers cannot respond effectively to information they don't have, or to information that is inaccurate or biased or arrives too late. It's like trying to navigate a ship in thick fog with a broken compass and yesterday's weather report.
Meadows even goes as far as to say that most of what goes wrong in systems goes wrong because of biased, late, or missing information. That's a really bold claim when you think about all the other factors.
It is bold, but this is precisely where she sees the high leverage. Adding or restoring information can be a powerful intervention, she argues, sometimes with surprising ease. Consider the compelling example she cites of the Dutch electric meter study.
Oh yeah, tell us about that one.
In houses where the electricity meter was installed in the visible front hall instead of being hidden away in the basement, electricity consumption was found to be 30% lower.
Just by making it visible.
Just by making it visible. This wasn't a change in parameters like the cost of electricity or the strength of some feedback loop back at the utility company. It was, as Meadows puts it, a new loop, delivering feedback to a place where it wasn't going before, directly and visibly to the user, the person actually controlling the consumption.
Right.
That immediate, transparent feedback on their usage changed their behavior significantly.
That's fascinating. Another powerful real-world example she gives is the Toxic Release Inventory, TRI, legislated in 1986 in the U.S.
Right.
New legislation required companies to publicly report their hazardous air pollutants. This information, which was previously hidden or very hard to get, became public record through the Freedom of Information Act. What happened next is truly incredible, isn't it?
It's stunning. Within just 2 years of this information being released, and this is key, even without any new fines, lawsuits, or mandated reductions, nationwide chemical emissions decreased by 40%. Some companies even voluntarily aimed for 90% reductions.
Just because people could see the data.
Exactly. It vividly illustrates the immense power of transparency and accessible, timely information to drive systemic change. Just making the previously hidden information visible changed the game entirely. Shame and public pressure became powerful feedback loops.
Information really is power, then.
It is. And Meadows points out that media, public relations firms, politicians, advertisers, they understand this very, very well. They often act as gatekeepers, regulating public information flow. They could be seen filtering and channeling information, often, she argues, for short-term, self-interested purposes, which can cause social systems to run amok by distorting the very feedback loops those systems need to self-correct and stay healthy.
Meadows provides some really thought-provoking, almost provocative examples of what she calls compelling feedback information flows that could dramatically alter system behavior if they were implemented.
They're quite pointed. Imagine, she says, if taxpayers got to specify on their return forms exactly how their payments must be spent. Or if any town or company placing a water intake pipe in a river was required by law to put it immediately downstream from its own wastewater outflow pipe.
Huh. That would change things quickly.
Wouldn't it? Or if officials who decided to invest in a nuclear power plant were required to have the resulting nuclear waste stored on their own front lawn.
Okay, maybe a bit extreme, but it makes the point.
It does. Or even, an old idea she brings up, if politicians who declare war were required by law to lead the troops into battle themselves. These scenarios create direct, unambiguous, and often deeply uncomfortable feedback loops that would almost certainly force drastically different decisions by connecting decision makers immediately and personally to the consequences of their choices.
Okay, let's bring this back to our senior software engineer. This hits home, right? Think of that dark, unmonitored corner of your system where errors silently accumulate. Maybe it's in some legacy service nobody wants to touch, and you only find out about the problems when a customer complains, or worse, when a critical production system crashes at 3 a.m.
We've all been there.
Now, imagine instead a real-time dashboard showing every single error, every latency spike, every resource utilization metric, immediately visible to the entire team, maybe even product managers. Which scenario is more likely to lead to a quick and effective fix? The transparent one, obviously.
Obviously. And this relates directly to the paramount importance of observability, comprehensive logging, and robust monitoring in modern software development. Making real-time metrics and alerts visible and accessible, not hidden away in some obscure tool to developers, operational teams, and even product managers, could be absolutely transformative for system health and team responsiveness.
It's not just dashboards, though, is it?
No, it's broader. Transparent project progress reports, clear communication channels between teams, accessible and up-to-date documentation. These are all examples of optimizing information flows within a team or organization, preventing crucial information from getting lost or stuck in silos. Imagine the immediate impact if every developer had clear, immediate feedback on, say, the carbon footprint of their cloud infrastructure usage. It could dramatically change architectural and deployment decisions toward more sustainable practices just by making that information visible.
So here's a challenge. Your team is struggling with frequent production incidents that are really hard to diagnose, leading to long resolution times and, understandably, frustrated customers. How could you leverage Meadows' insights on information flows to reduce these incidents? What specific information would you fight to make accessible, and to whom to improve the system's self-correction capabilities?
You'd really need to think about the flow of detailed error logs, real-time performance metrics, maybe user journey analytics to see where things break, and, crucially, transparent post-mortem findings shared across the entire organization, not just within the team, so everyone learns. It's about breaking down those information barriers.
Okay, next on Meadows' list, we ascend to the rules of the system, which encompasses things like incentives, punishments, and constraints. This feels like another significant jump up, going beyond just information to the actual directives governing behavior.
It is a big jump. Rules in Meadows' framework are the formal and informal mechanisms that dictate how a system operates, what behaviors are allowed or forbidden, and what consequences follow those behaviors. These include explicit things like laws, constitutions, corporate policies, social agreements, but also the implicit incentives and punishments that guide behavior every day. What gets rewarded, what gets ignored, what gets penalized. Meadows unequivocally states that rules are high leverage points, and that ultimately power over the rules is real power. If you can change the rules, you can fundamentally change the game the system is playing.
These are the fundamental directives, then, the code of conduct for the system. You can think of foundational social rules we take for granted. Thou shalt not kill, the principle of freedom of speech, the expectation that contracts are generally honored, or things like presidential term limits in the U.S. These aren't just suggestions. They define the boundaries of acceptable action within society.
Absolutely. Or consider Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union back in the late 1980s. His policy of glasnost was about opening up information flows, which we just discussed. But his perestroika was fundamentally about changing the economic rules, moving away from rigid central planning towards more market-oriented principles. These two interventions, targeting information flows and the rules of the game, led to tremendous change in the entire Soviet system, ultimately contributing to its dissolution.
Wow.
Meadows also invites us to do a little thought experiment. Imagine a college where the rules suddenly changed so that students graded teachers,
Ooh, interesting.
or where degrees didn't exist and students just learned until they felt satisfied they'd mastered something, or where faculty tenure was based on solving real-world problems instead of just academic publications, or maybe even group grading for all courses. These hypothetical changes in the fundamental rules vividly demonstrate their profound power in shaping behavior, incentives, and ultimately the entire culture and output of an institution.
It makes sense then why lobbyists congregate when Congress writes laws. They understand that power over the rules is incredibly significant. And Meadows notes that the Supreme Court, which interprets the Constitution, the ultimate rules for writing the rules, wields even greater power because they can shape the very framework by which all other rules are created and enforced. They operate at a meta level.
Exactly. And to truly understand the deepest malfunctions of systems, Meadows advises paying very close attention to the rules and, crucially, asking who has power over them, who gets to write the rules, who benefits from the current rules.
She offers a strong critique of the world trade system based on this, doesn't she?
She does. As it was emerging, she describes how her system's intuition sent alarm bells ringing because she saw it as a system potentially designed by corporations, run by corporations, for the benefit of corporations. Its rules, she argued, explicitly excluded almost any feedback from other sectors of society like labor or environmental groups. Its meetings were often held behind closed doors, blocking crucial information flow. And, she feared, it pushed nations into racing to the bottom, reinforcing loops, where they compete to weaken their own environmental and social safeguards to attract corporate investment.
A dangerous reinforcing loop.
Very. This, she argues, is a recipe for unleashing powerful success to the successful loops on a global scale, leading to unchecked corporate power accumulation and potentially eventual self-destruction, as the system ends up serving only a very narrow set of interests at the expense of the whole. It's a stark warning about who gets to set the rules.
Okay, let's bring this back to the tech world. For you, the senior software engineer, this connects directly to the principles that govern your work and your organization every day. Think about coding standards, architectural principles like maybe microservices best practices, API design guidelines, security policies, or even the often unstated criteria for promotions or performance reviews in your organization.
Oh, performance reviews, absolutely.
These are the rules that subtly or overtly shape developer behavior, influence system design choices, and ultimately dictate the characteristics of the software itself and the health of the engineering culture. If your performance review rules, for example, heavily reward individual heroism and firefighting over collaborative code ownership and prevention, well, you'll likely see that behavior reflected in your system's code quality and in your team dynamics. The rules drive the behavior.
It's like picturing a game, maybe Monopoly. If you change the fundamental rules, like how much money you collect when you pass go, or how properties can be traded, or whether you can go directly to jail without passing go,
Yeah.
you fundamentally alter the game's dynamics, the strategies players use, and its eventual outcome.
Yeah, it becomes a totally different game.
Exactly. Software systems are remarkably similar. The rules of interaction between components, API contracts, communication protocols, the rules governing deployment pipelines, required tests, approval gates, or even the informal rules of communication collaboration within a team, these all dictate what's possible, what's rewarded, and what ultimately emerges as the system's behavior and quality.
So here's a practical challenge. Your team frequently misses deadlines, but simply pushing for more effort or working longer hours hasn't worked and probably burned people out. Instead of focusing just on individual performance, maybe a parameter fix, how could you propose a fundamental change to the rules? Perhaps changing the project estimation process or how features are defined and scoped, definition of ready, or the sprint planning methodology itself. How could changing the rules improve predictability and quality, drawing on Meadows' framework?
Yeah, that requires looking upstream at the incentives and constraints that shape the current behavior, not just reacting to the symptom of missed deadlines.
Mm-hmm.
Are the rules encouraging unrealistic estimates? Is the rule for done too loose? That's where the leverage might be.
All right, another quick mental checkpoint here. We've navigated from the essential structure of information flows all about transparency and getting the right feedback to the right places,
Hmm?
to the fundamental directives of the rules of the system, and that critical question of who holds power over setting those rules.
And as you note, we're now moving into the truly higher echelons of leverage. These are interventions that go beyond even defining the system's explicit operational principles. We're really talking about the truly transformative forces within systems now, the ones that often seem untouchable because they're so fundamental, so deeply ingrained.
Our next profound leverage point is the power to self-organize. Meadows defines this as the inherent ability of a system to add, change, or evolve its own structure. This sounds incredibly powerful, almost like magic.
It does feel like
I know.
magic sometimes. And Meadows calls it the most stunning characteristic of living systems, and notably some complex social systems as well. It's their inherent capacity to generate entirely new structures and behaviors, to literally recreate themselves or spawn completely new forms over time. Think of evolution in biological systems, right? Where species adapt and diversify in unpredictable ways. Or think of the relentless pace of technical advancement and social revolution in human economies. This is the system's capacity to surprise itself with entirely novel solutions, to be truly adaptive and creative.
And what's the ultimate impact of a system having this power? Why is it so high on the list?
Meadows asserts that the ability to self-organize is fundamentally the strongest form of system resilience. Why? Because a system capable of evolving, of fundamentally changing its own internal design in response to challenges, can potentially survive almost any change in its environment. It's not locked into a single fixed blueprint that might become obsolete.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. Think about the human immune system developing new, completely unprecedented antibodies and responses to novel threats like new viruses it has never encountered before. Or consider the human brain itself, which through neuroplasticity constantly reorganizes its neural pathways to generate completely new thoughts, learn new skills, and adapt to new experiences. These are examples of self-organization in action.
But Meadows stresses that this isn't actually mysterious, is it? It's not really magic, there's a mechanism.
No, she's very clear on that. She explains that even the most complex forms of self-organization arise from what she calls marvelously clever rules for self-organization. These are underlying principles or genetic codes or social norms that dictate precisely how, where, and what a system can add or subtract from itself under specific conditions.
So what does it need to work?
She identifies two core components necessary for effective self-organization. First, requires evolutionary raw material, which is essentially a highly variable stock of information. Think of the vast genetic diversity of DNA within a species, or the accumulated knowledge stored in scientific libraries, or the diverse ideas and perspectives present in human culture. You need variety to select from.
Okay, raw material, what else?
Second, it requires a means for experimentation, a way to try out new combinations and possibilities. This could be spontaneous mutation in biology, or it could be human creativity, market rewards for innovation, dedicated research funding in science, or simply the drive to meet human needs or solve pressing problems in social systems. You need both a diverse ingredients and a way to mix them up and test the results. Without both, self-organization gets stifled.
So protecting this evolutionary raw material, this diversity, is absolutely critical for a system's long-term health and adaptability then.
Absolutely critical. Meadows highlights why biologists, as she puts it, worship biodiversity because that vast stock of varied DNA, accumulated over billions of years, is the ultimate source of evolutionary potential for life on Earth. Similarly, science libraries, research labs, universities, these are the vital sources of technological potential for human society.
So losing diversity is bad.
Very bad. Allowing species to go extinct is a systems crime, she states quite starkly. Just as randomly destroying science journals or eliminating entire fields of scientific inquiry would be a crime against our future innovation potential. And the same logic applies to human cultures, which she sees as a precious stock of behavioral repertoires for social evolution, offering diverse ways of thinking, living, and solving problems.
But we don't always value that diversity, do we?
Sadly, no. The problem, Meadows laments, is that people often appreciate the precious evolutionary potential of cultures even less than genetic variation, often due to a misplaced belief in their own culture's inherent superiority. This belief, she argues, tragically shuts down learning and cuts back resilience by stifling new ideas, dismissing different approaches, and preventing healthy cross-pollination.
This sounds like the ideal intervention point. Encouraging diversity and experimentation is obvious, but often incredibly unpopular to actually pursue and practice.
It often is. Meadows notes bluntly that encouraging variability and experimentation and diversity means losing control. Allowing 1,000 flowers to bloom means, well, anything could happen.
Mm,
And that unpredictability can be scary for individuals and highly threatening to existing power structures that benefit from maintaining the status quo.
right. Control is comfortable.
Exactly. Playing it safe by wiping out diversity, whether it's biological diversity through habitat destruction, cultural diversity through assimilation policies, social diversity through conformity pressure, or market diversity by favoring monopolies, is, in Meadows' framework, pushing this incredibly powerful leverage point in exactly the wrong direction. It sacrifices long-term resilience and future potential for the illusion of short-term control and predictability.
Okay, for you, the senior software engineer listening, here's some vivid imagery. Think of an ant colony. There's no central planner, right? No single architect ant directing every other ant. Yet incredibly complex, efficient, and resilient structures like nests and foraging patterns emerge from simple rules and local interactions between individual ants.
That's a perfect example of emergence. Or consider the explosive growth and incredible resilience of the open-source software movement. It's largely a self-organizing phenomenon that has created vast, robust, and continuously evolving software ecosystems, mostly without top-down command and control structures dictating everything.
So how does this relate to software development inside a company?
Well, it relates directly to concepts like emergent architecture in software. This is where complex, effective system designs are allowed to evolve organically from simple guiding principles and interactions between independent, empowered teams or components, rather than being rigidly dictated top-down by a single architect or committee.
Giving teams more autonomy.
Exactly. It's about empowering teams to experiment with different solutions, allowing for diverse approaches to problems, maybe using different languages or frameworks where appropriate, and fostering a culture of continuous learning and adaptation. It means trusting teams to find optimal solutions to the problems they face, rather than micromanaging every technical decision or enforcing rigid, monolithic standards that can stifle innovation and organic growth. Let the system find its own best path sometimes.
So here's a challenge. Your organization is struggling with innovation. You see teams often defaulting to old, familiar solutions and resisting new approaches. How could you apply this concept of self-organization to foster a more innovative software development environment? And importantly, what potential scary outcomes might you need to prepare for, given that self-organization inherently embraces unpredictability and a degree of loss of centralized control?
Yeah, you might need to prepare for things like a temporary increase in technological complexity as different solutions emerge, maybe a departure from familiar, comfortable technologies, or even the emergence of solutions that challenge existing power structures or establish ways of working within the organization. It requires a tolerance for managed chaos, you could say.
Ascending even further, right near the top, we arrive at the goals of the system. Meadows posits this is its ultimate purpose or function. This seems like a truly monumental lever to pull.
It truly is. The goals define what the system is fundamentally trying to achieve, its ultimate reason for being, its overarching purpose. And Meadows asserts, quite powerfully, that a system's goal is a leverage point superior to the self-organizing ability of a system.
Superior even to self-organization. Why?
The reasoning is simple but profound. If the ultimate goal of the system changes, then everything else below it on this list, the physical stocks and flows, the feedback loops, the information flows, the rules, and yes, even the self-organizing behavior will eventually be twisted, reconfigured, realigned to conform to that new goal. The entire system fundamentally reorients itself around that new purpose. The goal dictates the direction of evolution.
Meadows illustrates this with the contentious example of genetic engineering. How does that fit?
She argues its goodness or badness isn't inherent in the technology itself, but depends entirely on who is wielding it, with what goal. If corporations wield it primarily for creating marketable products and maximizing profit, that's a very different goal, a very different selection mechanism, a very different direction for evolution, compared to, say, using the same technology primarily for environmental restoration or curing rare diseases in a nonprofit context. The technology is neutral. Its application and impact are defined by the underlying goal driving its use.
Okay. And while individual balancing loops within a system have their own sub-goals, like a thermostat maintains specific temperature or prices try to balance supply and demand, these are always nested within the larger system's overarching goal, right?
Exactly. Those sub-goals serve the larger purpose. Meadows points to the incisive observation by economist John Kenneth Galbraith about the implicit corporate goal, which he argued is often to engulf everything, to continuously increase market share, to bring the world, customers, suppliers, even regulators, under its control in order to shield its core operations from uncertainty in competition.
That sounds potentially problematic.
Meadows starkly likens this singular corporate goal, when unchecked, to the goal of a cancer or any living population seeking to expand indefinitely. It only becomes problematic, she argues, when it's not balanced by higher-level balancing feedback loops. For instance, the societal goal of fair market competition must ultimately trump the individual corporate goal of eliminating all competitors. Otherwise, the system becomes dangerously unstable and monopolistic. The higher goal needs to constrain the lower one.
Earlier, we discussed how just changing the players in a system, firing the manager, electing a new politician is generally a low-leverage intervention. But Meadows makes a crucial exception here, which directly relates to goals, doesn't she?
Yes, she does.
Oh,
The critical exception is at the top, where a single player can have the power to change the system's goal. A leader can redefine the purpose. She cites Ronald Reagan as an example from her time. By simply enunciating and consistently promoting a new national goal summarized as "get government off our backs and reduce its size and influence," he effectively swung hundreds or thousands or millions of perfectly intelligent, rational people off in the new direction.
just by stating a new goal.
Just by powerfully articulating and pursuing a new overarching goal. This single shift in declared purpose fundamentally changed U.S. public discourse, policy priorities, resource allocation, and the perceived role of government for decades afterwards. It demonstrates the immense power a leader can wield by successfully redefining the system's perceived goal.
Okay, for you, the senior software engineer, here's a useful mnemonic to keep this in mind. Your system's true purpose isn't what you say it is, it's what it does. Think about it. Is your software team implicitly optimized for shipping features as quickly as possible, regardless of quality? Or is it optimized for delivering maximum customer value, even if it's slower? Or maybe maximizing short-term profit, or ensuring rock-solid reliability above all else? These different underlying goals, whether they're explicitly stated or just implicitly driven by incentives and culture, will result in very different behaviors and outcomes from the team and the software.
This is fundamentally about aligning the true operational purpose of a project, a team, or even an entire engineering organization with the observable behavior of that system. If an organization's stated goal is innovation, right? Everyone talks about innovation. But the implicit goal, the one driven by the actual incentives, metrics, or cultural norms, is really avoiding risk at all costs, then the system, the teams, the processes, the technology choices will behave in a way that minimizes risk, not one that fosters genuine innovation. The real goal wins out.
Right. Actions speak louder than words.
Exactly. A software system whose implicit goal is lowest possible cost will behave very differently, make different trade-offs, than one whose implicit goal is highest possible uptime, even if they use the exact same parameters and many of the same rules. As a senior engineer, being able to recognize these implicit or explicit goals and having the courage to challenge them when they are misaligned with desired outcomes or causing negative consequences is a profoundly powerful, though often difficult, intervention.
It's like picturing a ship's rudder again. Changing the rudder setting doesn't instantly change the engine, the sails, or the crew, but it fundamentally changes the ship's entire direction. It aligns all its energy and resources towards a new heading, a new destination. That's the profound power of changing a system's ultimate goal. Everything else eventually falls into line behind it.
So for a real-world scenario, your organization's stated goal is digital transformation and becoming a more agile, customer-centric company. That's what's on the posters. Yet you consistently observe behaviors that contradict this, maybe strong resistance to adopting new tools, slow adoption of agile methodologies, a deep reluctance to deprecate legacy systems that are holding things back. How might Meadows' concept of system goals help you diagnose and address this discrepancy? And what approach might you take to try and realign the implicit actual goals, maybe stability, predictability, protecting fiefdoms, with the stated desired ones?
Yeah, that requires looking at what's really driving behavior.
Exactly. You might need to examine the incentives, the metrics being tracked, the leadership behaviors being modeled, what goals are actually being rewarded or punished in the system, regardless of the official mission statement.
Okay, we're getting to the very top now, the deepest levels of leverage. We've covered the power of self-organization, the system's ability to evolve and embrace diversity.
Resilience through evolution.
and system goals, the ultimate purpose that shapes everything below it.
The rudder.
And it's crucial to remember that as we climb higher on this ladder, the interventions become rarer, their impact more profound, and frankly, the resistance you'll likely face to implement them gets significantly greater. People defend the status quo, especially at these levels.
Absolutely. But this is precisely where true, transformative, and lasting change actually happens, according to Meadows. It's worth the effort if you can manage it.
Okay, the second highest leverage point on Meadows' list. This is number 11, the paradigm or mindset out of which the system arises. Okay, this sounds like something incredibly fundamental almost. Philosophical.
It is. It's getting very deep now. The paradigm, as Meadows defines it, is the shared idea in the minds of society. It's the great big unstated assumptions, the deepest set of beliefs about how the world works. These beliefs are often unstated, she says, precisely because it is unnecessary to state them. Everyone within that culture or group already knows them, accepts them as reality. They are the foundational cultural assumptions, the shared mental models that shape absolutely everything else.
Can you give some examples of these deep, often unstated paradigms?
Sure. Meadows lists several potent ones prevalent in Western culture. Money measures something real and has real meaning. Therefore, people who are paid less are literally worth less. That's a deep assumption. Or growth is good, always. Or nature is primarily a stock of resources to be converted to human purposes. Or maybe evolution stopped with the emergence of Homo sapiens, or even the very idea that one can own land.
Wow, yeah, we rarely question those.
Exactly. Meadows highlights that these common assumptions of our current culture have often utterly dumbfounded other cultures throughout history and across the globe, which powerfully demonstrates their arbitrary human-constructed nature rather than them being inherent universal truths about reality. They are agreements, powerful ones, but still agreements.
So how does this paradigm act as a leverage point?
Meadows asserts that paradigms are quite literally the sources of systems. From these shared social agreements about the nature of reality, all system goals, all information flows, all feedback loops, all physical stocks and flows, and everything else about the systems we create are ultimately derived. She quotes Ralph Waldo Emerson, who grasped this idea beautifully. Every nation and every man instantly surround themselves with a material apparatus which exactly corresponds to their state of thought.
The outer world reflects the inner world.
Precisely. Emerson notes that the least enlargement of ideas would cause the most striking changes of external things. Change the fundamental idea, change the material world that arises from it.
So those historic scientific revolutions we mentioned earlier, Copernicus, Einstein, maybe Darwin, they weren't just about new discoveries. They were fundamental shifts in paradigm, shifts in how reality itself was perceived. And these led to profound, cascading systemic changes across society.
Absolutely. Think of Copernicus and Kepler shifting the Earth from the unquestioned center of the universe to just one planet orbiting the sun. Or Einstein's theory of relativity completely overturning Newtonian physics by positing matter-energy interchangeability. Or Adam Smith's foundational economic theories reshaping how societies thought about wealth and markets. These weren't just tweaks to existing models. They were complete reimaginings of reality, true paradigm shifts.
And they demonstrate the immense leverage of changing a society's deepest beliefs. But it must be incredibly hard to do.
Profoundly hard. Meadows cautions exactly that. While paradigms are the greatest leverage points in terms of their potential impact, they are also the ones the system will resist changing it the most, often with fierce, even violent opposition.
Why such strong resistance?
Because challenging a paradigm feels like challenging reality itself. It threatens people's fundamental understanding of the world, their identity, their place within it. This is why, she notes sadly, societies sometimes rub out truly enlightened beings, prophets, revolutionaries, scientists, who dare to challenge these fundamental assumptions too forcefully or too early.
Okay, let's connect this to software again. For you, the senior software engineer, this connects to the fundamental design principles, the core philosophy of a programming language, like object-oriented versus functional, or an operating system, like Unix versus Windows, or even a widely adopted architectural pattern, like microservices versus monoliths. Its core paradigm dictates what feels natural, what's easy, and what's difficult or even impossible to build upon it. It shapes what developers even conceive as possible solutions. And changing that core paradigm, trying to get a team steeped in imperative programming to adopt functional programming, for instance, is often a monumental task, leading to deep-seated resistance, confusion, and requiring significant re-education and unlearning.
Absolutely. This level is about challenging the deeply ingrained beliefs, the unquestioned truths within the tech industry, or perhaps within your specific organization. For example, the unquestioned belief that agile is always the best approach for every problem, or that microservices solve all problems by default if you just implement them correctly, or maybe that performance should always be maximized, even at the cost of maintainability or overall system simplicity.
These sound like common assumptions.
They are. A senior engineer who can recognize these implicit paradigms, who can step back and ask, why do we always build X this way? Is this paradigm still serving our actual needs, or is it holding us back? That engineer can potentially initiate the most profound and far-reaching shifts. It's about questioning the very foundation of how problems are defined and solved within the engineering culture. It's about thinking.
So, for a thought experiment, describe a dominant paradigm within the software industry today. Maybe it's move fast and break things, or perhaps the widespread belief that AI will solve everything if we just throw more data and compute at it.
Mhm.
How does this prevailing paradigm influence the design and behavior of systems and teams in your organization? And what deep challenges would you face if you tried to genuinely shift or even just question that paradigm?
You'd likely face disbelief, maybe ridicule, certainly resistance, because you're questioning something people accept as just the way things are.
And finally, we reach the absolute apex of Donella Meadows' hierarchy, the highest leverage point of all, number 12, the power to transcend paradigms.
Yeah.
Okay, this sounds even more philosophical than the last one. What does this even mean?
It is the ultimate level of leverage, and yes, it's deeply philosophical, but also intensely practical. It's the ability, as Meadows puts it, to hold lightly to any paradigm. It's the deep understanding that everything we think we know about the world is only a model. It is the profound humility of not knowing, the recognition that all our mental constructs, all our paradigms, are ultimately incomplete, imperfect representations of a reality that is always far richer and more complex.
So it's not about finding the right paradigm, but being free from being locked into any paradigm.
Exactly. It's not about replacing one rigid belief system with another potentially equally rigid one. It's about achieving a state of mental freedom where you are not imprisoned by the limitations of any single viewpoint.
Meadows states that this is the true mastery of systems. How does one even begin to attain something like that? It sounds almost mystical.
It does have that quality. It allows for radical change precisely because it frees one from the limitations and the inherent rigidities of any single viewpoint, any single way of seeing the world. However, Meadows immediately admits, very realistically, that while this is the highest leverage point, magical leverage points are not easily accessible. As she says, there are no cheap tickets to mastery.
So how do you get there?
She emphasizes that it requires both rigorous intellectual work and deep personal work. It requires rigorous analyzing a system, using all the tools and models available, and simultaneously rigorously casting off your own paradigms, deliberately challenging your own assumptions, immersing oneself in that often uncomfortable state of humility of not knowing. Ultimately, mastery, she suggests, has less to do with pushing leverage points than it does with strategically, profoundly, madly letting go and dancing with the system.
Dancing with the system, I like that.
It implies an intuitive, adaptive, fluid, almost spiritual engagement with the flow of reality itself, rather than trying to rigidly control it based on a fixed model.
Okay, for you, the senior software engineer, picture a master martial artist. Someone who doesn't fight by fixed rules or a predetermined style, but adapts fluidly, almost effortlessly, to every move of their opponent, seemingly inventing responses on the fly, flowing with the situation. That's kind of like transcending the paradigm of rigid combat techniques. It's not about learning more rules. It's about being free from the rules when necessary.
That's a beautiful analogy. For a senior software engineer, this means achieving a level of intellectual agility and humility where you're not fundamentally bound by a specific programming language you love, or a particular framework you know well, or a single methodology like Scrum, or any one architectural pattern like microservices.
Being tool agnostic, almost.
Exactly. It's about recognizing when your established mental models, your personal paradigms about the right way to build software, are no longer serving the problem at hand. And crucially, being willing to completely discard them, even if they've brought you success in the past, and embrace a completely new way of thinking, even if it feels uncomfortable or unfamiliar.
That takes courage.
It takes immense courage and humility. This involves continuous lifelong learning, developing a deep comfort with ambiguity and uncertainty, and cultivating the intellectual courage to challenge not just external assumptions, but your own most fundamental beliefs of how software should be built or how complex problems should be solved. This, Meadows suggests, is the path of the true innovator, someone who doesn't just improve existing systems within the current paradigm, but occasionally invents entirely new ones by seeing beyond the current limitations and perceived impossibilities.
So, for a final thought for you listening, reflect on a time you encountered a really thorny problem in your work where your standard approaches, your go-to techniques, your established paradigms completely failed and you were truly stuck. How did you eventually transcend your paradigm to find a solution if you did? Or, looking back, how might you have done so if you had this framework at your disposal then? What was the mental shift, the letting go that ultimately unlocked the breakthrough?
That kind of reflection can be incredibly insightful.
What an incredible journey through Donella Meadows' profound framework. That was intense. Let's do a quick mega recap of these 12 leverage points, maybe starting from the bottom again, the least influential, and climbing all the way back up to that ultimate mastery.
Sounds good. Okay. At the very bottom, the lowest leverage, we have one. Parameters, numbers, and constants, those surface-level tweaks you make to quantities, the knobs and dials.
Then slightly more impactful too. The size of buffers and other stabilizing stocks, the reservoirs of capacity like inventory or cash reserves that absorb shock and create stability.
Next up, 3. Stock and flow structures, the fundamental plumbing and architectural blueprint of the system itself, how things are physically connected. Hard to change, but influential.
Crucially important, 4. The length of delays relative to the rate of change, where managing the system speed or respecting its inherent delays becomes key to avoiding oscillations and overshoot.
Then moving into the information control sphere, we find 5. The strength of the negative balancing feedback loops, those essential self-correcting mechanisms that seek stability in goals. Strengthening them helps resilience.
More potent still, 6. The strength of the positive reinforcing feedback loops, those self-amplifying mechanisms driving growth or collapse, where the key leverage is often reducing their gain, slowing them down.
Highly impactful is 7. The structure of information flows. Who has access to what information, when, and how? Emphasizing transparency and accurate, timely feedback here is huge.
Even more profound, 8. The rules of the system, encompassing the explicit and implicit incentives, punishments, and constraints, and always asking who holds power over setting those rules.
Then, near the top, the truly transformative ability of 9. Self-organization, the system's inherent power to learn, adapt, diversify, and evolve its own structure. Fostering this is key to long-term resilience.
Superior even to that, 10. The goals of the system, the ultimate purpose or function that dictates everything else within the system. Changing the goal changes everything eventually.
Deeper still, 11. The paradigm or mindset out of which the system arises, those shared, often unstated, fundamental beliefs about how the world works, which are the very source of our system's designs and goals.
And finally, at the absolute apex, the ultimate leverage point. 12. The power to transcend paradigms. That profound humility of not knowing, the ability to hold lightly to any mental model and truly dance with the system.
And just to reiterate, the higher up this list you go, generally the rarer these interventions become in practice, the more profound their potential impact, and critically, the more resistance you'll likely face from the system itself and from those entrenched within its existing structure. People defend paradigms fiercely.
Yeah.
But this, Meadows emphasizes, is precisely where true, transformative, and lasting change happens. It's the harder path, but potentially the most rewarding.
Okay, and just for your mental flashcards, for attention, here are those 12 leverage points one last time.
Got your mental pen ready. Parameters, buffers, stock and flow structures, delays, balancing feedback loops, strength, reinforcing feedback loops, strengths, information flows, rules of the system, self-organization, goals of the system, the paradigm, transcending paradigms.
Excellent. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. This one from the brilliant writer G.K. Chesterton. He wrote, "The real trouble with this world of ours is not that it is an unreasonable world, nor even that it is a reasonable one. The commonest kind of trouble is that it is nearly reasonable, but not quite. Life is not an illogicality, yet it is a trap for logicians."
Oh, that's good. And it perfectly captures the essence of systems thinking, doesn't it? Our world, the systems we live and work in, they are complex, they're constantly changing, often inherently self-organizing in ways we don't expect. They stubbornly defy our desire for neat, linear, purely logical solutions, and often reward those counterintuitive approaches we talked about. It is a trap for those who think purely logically, linearly, without understanding the underlying dynamics, the feedback loops, the delays, the sheer nonlinearity of how real systems behave.
So we really encourage you, our listener, to try and observe the systems around you in your work, in your teams, your communities, even your daily routines through this new lens of leverage points.
Hmm.
Start asking yourself, where are the real leverage points here? Am I just tweaking parameters, fiddling with the knobs, or am I truly engaging with the system's underlying structure, its information flows, its goals, or maybe even its deepest paradigms? Where's my energy best spent for real change?
And Danella Meadows doesn't just offer these cool analytical tools. She really emphasizes the profound personal transformation that's often required to truly engage with systems effectively. This includes a deep commitment to staying humble, to always be learning, knowing that your models of reality, your understanding, are always incomplete and approximate. Nobody has the full picture.
That's a big one. Humility.
Huge. It also means embracing complexity, even celebrating disorder, variety, and diversity, rather than trying to force uniformity or constantly oversimplify things just to make them fit neat boxes.
Mm.
It requires expanding your time horizons, looking beyond the immediate gains or problems to consider the long-term consequences, and understanding how fast and slow processes are often intimately coupled together.
She also urges us to defy those traditional disciplinary boundaries, right? To follow the system wherever it leads, regardless of what academic field or technical domain it might cross into. Problems don't respect our organizational charts.
Exactly. And perhaps most profoundly, she urges us to expand the boundary of our caring, to include the whole system, to truly understand, as she put it, that no part of the human race is separate, either from other human beings or from the global ecosystem. We're all interconnected.
And that final point.
And perhaps most importantly of all, especially when things look bleak, Meadows implores us, don't erode the goal of goodness. This means continually striving for positive values, things like justice, equity, sustainability, community, human flourishing, even when societal cynicism is high, even when the immediate path seems difficult, messy, or unclear. Keep that higher goal in sight.
Wow. Ultimately, it seems the highest leverage point isn't just about changing external systems, it's about your internal system. Your own willingness to learn, to adapt, to stay humble, and to continually question your own deepest mental models, your own paradigms. This deep dive really is just the beginning of that profound, lifelong journey for you.